On this episode of Arts Weekly, I'm speaking with George Kalamaras and Mary Ann Cain from the IPFW English Department.
It goes into what yogis refer to as superconsciousness. And again, what you're doing is you're short-circuiting your rational hold on language.
And Jeff Kazaza and Haley Brandt from the IPFW Theater Department.
I've always been fascinated with Brecht, and I've always wanted to do his play, a play by him at some point. So this is my first Brecht play.
This is Arts Weekly.
Arts Weekly is a production of the College of Visual and Performing Arts at IPFW, offering degrees in fine arts, music, theater, and visual communication and design. IPFW, the energy of arts.
Hi, I'm Chuck O'Connor, and you're watching Arts Weekly. Joining me is George Kalamaras and Mary Ann Cain from the IPFW Department of English and Linguistics. George is the author of 12 books of poetry, and his work has been featured in numerous journals and anthologies. His latest book is called Kingdom of Throat-Stuck Luck. Mary Ann's work of fiction, memoirs, and blurred genre has been featured in numerous journals as well. Her two latest books are Composing Public Space and Down from Moonshine. Both authors have been awarded several prizes for their writings, and they are married to each other. Thank you both for coming on to Arts Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chuck. It's great to be here.
You both teach at IPFW. Mary Ann, what do you teach?
I teach creative writing, mostly fiction, and it's called creative nonfiction, which includes memoir, but is also many other kind of genres as well. And I teach rhetoric classes. They're kind of combo classes with poetics and rhetoric, like composing the self. Right now I'm teaching creativity and community. And I also teach women's studies cross list.
Okay, and how long have you been at the university?
I've been here since 1995.
Okay. George, what do you teach at IPFW?
I teach primarily creative writing and rhetoric classes and some literature classes as well. And in the creative writing classes, I teach not only the general introduction to creative writing, but my focus is poetry. So the upper level classes I teach beyond the 100 level are mostly poetry.
Oh, poetry. Okay, very well. And how long have you been at IPFW?
I've been here 22 years. I came in 1990.
All right. And where did you get your education?
We got our doctoral degrees. We both got them together at SUNY Albany. That was the most recent. But and we also did other work before that.
Oh, very, very good. Well, Mary Ann, we're going to start with you. Your latest book, Down from Moonshine. It surrounds the life of a fictional character named Viney. And the arc of her life from the 1920s through the 1970s. It also has additional storylines in it. But tell us a little bit about this book, Down from Moonshine, and some of the themes that you explore in it.
I was very interested in, well, let me first start with how the story came into being. It's based on a place that I grew up with, about a block from where I grew up with in the suburbs of Chicago. Right. And it had been purported to be a speakeasy and a racing stables back in the 1920s. So there was a lot of local lore about the place. But I worked there one summer like just about everybody in the neighborhood did, and I was very interested in the fact that it was so much like a Kentucky plantation in terms of the theme, and it was my initiation into like the real world of work and the kind of stratified relationships that people had based on race and class and gender. So after a few years, I started to really think about the impact that experience had on me. So Viney is, she is the character who has been there from speakeasy times and all the way into the 1978 is when the book opens. And Viney represents that longing for to make history speak to us in ways that are very personal and intimate, where she's the memory of the stables, which is the place where the book is set. And she is there when there's a tragic stable fire that takes the lives of all the horses. And so her job in life for the next several decades becomes to bring the horses back to life, which is really a way of saying, I want history to be alive. And she spends her life calling the horses back into being. And by the end of the book, you get to see if she succeeds or not.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
See, you know, it's sort of interesting, though, the way the book goes back in time to the 1920s South, Georgia. That's where she's originally from. And
That's
she leaves Georgia. And what I enjoyed about the book was the way in which you were able to capture how she talks to herself, how she talks to others. You know, this is an African-American woman from the South, now living in Chicago, and how she saw the world with, you know, surrounding her circumstances. How does one begin to learn how to capture another person's voice and way of thinking completely as a novelist?
Well, that's one reason it took me about 12 years to write the book, is because I wanted to make sure I got that right. So there was a lot of research involved. Viney is actually multiracial. She has a Cherokee mother and a white grandfather on one side, and then her father is African-American, former slave. But I did a lot of research on the African-American community and African-American I don't want to say dialect, but speech. And so some of it was reading, some of it, you know, coming through literary works by Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, other writers, especially of like in the 1980s era, women of color writers. Some of it was just remembering what I grew up with in Chicago and the sounds of those voices. And some of it was just trying it out and seeing how it sounded. So it was a lot of experimenting with it. But ultimately, I did a lot of work to make sure I got it right. One thing I want to mention is part of my work, I went to the DuSable Museum of African American History and inquired of Margaret Burroughs, who was the founder of the museum, about Bronzeville, which is the area where some of my characters are from, to get a feel for that neighborhood.
I see.
And
so it's a real neighborhood.
Yes.
And it really comes from your past. You've actually kind of observed it. That's an interesting way of proceeding.
Yeah, it's a combination of research and experience.
Wonderful. George, moving on to your books of poetry, you know, your latest one, The Kingdom of Throat-Stuck Luck, just came out earlier this year, I believe.
Yes, actually it came out the very end of last year.
Two of your influences are Hindu, Eastern thought, myth, philosophy, as well as Western surrealism, fair enough to say.
Sure.
And what are the similarities that you find between, I guess, surrealism, which has a lot to do with one's dreams and one's perceptions, unconscious, and Hindu, Eastern thought that really teaches one to see through illusions and our own ways that we kind of misperceive the world? How do you join the two in your poetry?
Well, it's a very odd marriage. it's a wonderful question, actually, but it's probably not as peculiar of a match as we might at first think. Because, as you said, Chuck, surrealism really tends to deal with the unconscious and the dream state. Another way to talk about that would be intuition. In many ways, I think that Western intellectual thought, as much as even I'm steeped in Western intellectual thought, there's an overabundance of that. It's almost as if we're walking around lopsided in terms of the intellect and linearity. So the surrealist movement was really there not to replace the intellectual thought, but to bring it into a deeper balance, a greater harmony with our intuition, with our dream state. So by the surrealists delving into the unconscious, they uncover material that you can't access as readily through the intellect, and they bring that into balance. Well, Eastern meditation, the Eastern wisdom traditions, the yogic path, for example, does something really similarly, although it doesn't go into the unconscious. It goes into what yogis refer to as superconsciousness. And again, what you're doing is you're short-circuiting your rational hold on language, short-circuiting your rational hold on discourse when you meditate. And so really some of the perceptions that come from a sustained practice of meditation, for example, are actually quite similar to some of the perceptions that come from surrealists in the unconscious. So they actually sort of have an interesting combination.
And they do in your poetry. And then just to give you an example, I'm just going to read just 2 lines of a poem that would probably take too long to read on the air. But
Sure.
It's a poem called Each Night, or Each Night, I believe. And it says here, when Vallejo was in jail, James Joyce was making life to a shadow of a wife. To leap from sumac stem to Chinese cabbage fields is half a mulberry mood. Now, if I, like perhaps our audience, is thinking, what does that mean? How do I rationalize it? What is he trying to say? I don't know if it's going to work for you. But if you read the words and step back from it, they seem to give one a sense, a feeling of what they mean, more than I guess, as you say, a really irrational meaning.
Right.
Is that what you're trying to do?
In large part, and and in many respects, that's what poetry in general does. The surrealist influence that I have pushes the envelope that way further. But to kind of back up to say that that's what poetry does is, when you look at any work of art, if you examine the individual components, if you're listening to the third movement of Brahms' Third Symphony, you don't want to sit there and say, and I don't think most people do, oh, I'm feeling this deep melancholy now because the cellos just came in on an E minor. I mean, if that's even in that movement. We experience it. There's a totality. So that happens with any poem.
We don't describe it.
We don't describe it because that's not how we're apprehending it. We're apprehending it as an entity. So in many ways, yes, that's what a poem does, but as you rightly say, the surrealist poem is going to challenge that even further, and it's going to say, well, what are the associations there? In fact, in that couplet that you quoted, I was having fun trying to get rid of the cliche, making love, and saying making life. The words look very similar, but if you really think about that combination, when you make love, you do make life.
Yeah, you do.
Whether you produce offspring or not, you're making life. You're enlarging the self in some way.
And I like the whole term mulberry mood. Now, 2 words you don't usually hear together. A mulberry mood. Now, I don't know what that means, but I know what it feels like. Somehow or another, I got it without rationalizing it. So that's what I find really fascinating about poetry. How do each of you find teaching a whole new generation of writers and readers of poetry and fiction here at IPFW? I'll start with you, Marianne.
It's changed over the years, and I'm not sure I can exactly account what's changed, but I find that we actually have more students who are interested and really dedicated to it than we have in the past.
Wonderful.
So it's exciting to see more people who really are interested in not just being consumers of the art, but they're actually wanting to produce it. They have more venues for for presenting their art. They have our student, every semester we have a student reading, so anybody who's a student can present their work. George has got the Three Rivers, the first Friday readings at the food co-op.
That's right, at the food co-op there on Sherman and
Spring Street, 1612 Sherman.
Every first Friday of the month you read poetry?
We have 2 guest writers, local writers, who read rather than an open forum, so that we actually have people that we feature that way. And
I see.
Yeah, we get really great audiences there as well.
And one of my students in Creativity and Community last spring started his own reading series as part of his public project for the class. That is at the Peace Frog Coffee House. It's the first Thursdays. So there's just been a lot. It's been gratifying to us because we've put a lot of time and effort into trying to cultivate some sense of having community and showing people that you really need to have other people with you in this enterprise.
And read it. That's all the time we have on the show, but I really, really appreciate the way you both have brought sort of a poetic scene to our city and how you've brought together other poets and other writers. You mentioned every first Friday at the Three Rivers Co-op, there's a poetry reading. You also do it quite often, poetry readings and readings at Triac down Well,
501 East Breckenridge.
thank you very much.
Coming up, actually,
Let's not
this
forget.
Saturday.
Let's not forget the IPFW Visiting Writers Series.
And
that I
let's not
coordinate,
forget
too.
that.
Right.
You know, it's wonderful. I could talk to both of you for hours. We don't have hours, but thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks
the
Chuck,
a
show.
lot.
thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.
This was really pleasurable.
Yes.
Okay, have a good summer if I don't see you then.
Okay.
Thank you.
The books of George Kalamaras and Mary Ann Cain can be purchased at the IPFW bookstore or online at Amazon.com. For more information about the IPFW Department of English, visit ipfw.edu/English or call the office at 481-6841. Arts Weekly will return in a moment.